Good evening, everybody. Glad to see everyone out here tonight. Happy birthday, East Bridgewater. For anyone that doesn't know, we're heading fast for our 200th anniversary on June the 14th, 2023. A little behind West Bridgewater and a little behind North Bridgewater, which is, of course, excellent. We have an educated bunch here. We're in trouble already. I hope you're ready. We are working with the Historic Commission, of course, our committee. Got to make sure we get our committees and commissions straight. We've been working now for about a year or a little bit longer to put together some stuff. And the idea of having some historic programs was something that came up, and obviously it's a good idea. And if we don't get everything in tonight, we'll hold another one in the fall, because the idea is to just engage people in town and surrounding areas that would enjoy some history that you might not know of. And East Bridgewater has lots of great history. To that end, we have a Civil War group in town. It's called the East Bridgewater Civil War Roundtable. We meet every month at the public library, and we think about the public library as the oldest continuous service to the town in the same building. They're 125 years this year. That's pretty cool. So we still meet there. There's a lot of good memories just going there. We established that in 2005. And I didn't remember that, but some of our ladies here are wearing our sweatshirts that say established in 2005, so that's pretty good. We founded that after an idea of studying some of our local soldiers, and myself and Rui Santos and Marianne Roan, if anybody remembers her, she was also a teacher in the school system. We got together and said, let's study the Civil War and have a talk group, because we figured the interest would be there. So Marianne and myself, we met here at Town Hall. We met in her classroom. We met several places, and nobody ever came. It was just me and her. And we talked for 2 hours, just the two of us, about the Civil War. I learned so much from her. She was avid on the history. And we just really had a good time. And one day we got to use this room. And finally it happened. People came in the door. And it was like a line. And they were coming in. And every one of them came in and said, Little League sign-ups? No. But then, enter Dr. Turner. He must have told all his friends. And Judy and Carol, wherever they're sitting, I know you're out here somewhere. These guys showed up. They're both former teachers. And before you know it, we were having, 15, 20, 25, 30 sometimes. No real guest speakers. We basically just talk amongst ourselves and bring in, some authors and some people that join us. So it's been a real good thing. It's the second Tuesday of every month, and we meet for about 2 hours. We start at 6:30 and finish at 8:30. And the funny part of it is, at 8:30, nobody seems to want to go home. They all want to keep talking. So there's something very interesting about the American Civil War that keeps us talking about it. So tonight, we're going to give you an earful. I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Rui Santos. I had to write these dates down. He taught East Bridgewater High School in the history department for 36 years. Started in 1969, just after I left as a student. So I left in 69, he came in, opened the door for him. And he retired in 2005, and he's had some great adventures. And he's going to talk to us tonight about one person in particular, and then whatever else you want to talk about. So, Rui Santos.
Dale neglected to tell you that the East Bridgewater Civil War Roundtable actually made national television.
Yes, it did.
On the Peacock Network. One night we were there. I don't know, Dale could tell you the story of how they contacted him.
They were looking to do a documentary, this group out of Brooklyn, New York, and they wanted to do a documentary about how people teach the Civil War today and how people remember the Civil War. And they worked on it with us for quite a stretch. And finally they showed up and they filmed 2 hours, but we got about a 10-minute spot on this broadcast, and we had people calling us from all over the country saying, I saw you on TV. So that was pretty exciting. The program was called
Who do you think we are?
The Civil War, Who Do We Think We Are? So if you can look it up, it's still out there, and
Yeah,
they
it's
show
on-
the library, it was good.
It was a good program.
Yeah.
And they had come from Maine that day, and they expected to stop in and spend about 15 minutes to a half an hour with us, and they stayed for the whole 2 hours we were there. They made us all sign release forms
Yeah.
so that they could use our presence in their publication. I have never seen it.
Oh.
I have seen the, what do you call it? I lost my glasses. What did I do with my
They're on the table there, right near the.
Oh, right here, okay, there you go. That's how old I am. Once upon a time I didn't need it. I've never seen it. I've seen advertisements for it on YouTube, but I have never seen I've never seen the program.
See if we can get a copy.
Yeah, yeah, it'd be nice if we could. All right, but I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here to talk about a person that most people in the 20th century know nothing about and have no recognition of perhaps one of the most famous and notable politicians and figures in the United States of America, and he is directly, I say directly connected to the town of East Bridgewater. I'll get to, actually, I'm going to tell you a little bit about him before I tell you how he is connected here. But the man is Edward Everett. This is Edward Everett, and a couple of drawings, pictures, or whatever. He was a character of him there. But Edward Everett, in the 19th century, was the man in the United States. And his accomplishments, I would like to have half of his accomplishments. He's born in 1794. He enters Harvard University at age 13, graduates from Harvard at age 17. And it is recorded and said that he was actually a student, that he came to Harvard to learn, not to just socialize. And Harvard will play a part in why he came to East Bridgewater. At the time, East Bridgewater was the East Parish of Bridgewater. He graduates, and he immediately becomes a professor at Harvard. They graduated him, they hired him. He had about a 2-year period. He actually studied to be a minister. He had about a 2-year period where he went to the Brattle Street Unitarian Church. But at age 20, he said, and he admitted, he had not had enough life experience to be a real minister who could minister to his people. So he went back to Harvard. Harvard hired him, immediately put him on the payroll teaching Greek literature and Greek history. He wasn't there but a year when they sent him to Germany to get a PhD. And he is the first American, at least as far as we know, that is recorded, to earn a German doctorate of philosophy in Greek literature and Greek history. And luckily for him, the Harvard let him spend the next 2 years crisscrossing Europe in the 1820s, studying what was going on in Europe, and in particular, in the 1820s and 1830s, the big political controversy in the world was the Greeks attempting to win their independence from the Ottoman or Turkish Empire. So he spent a lot of time in Greece. I have read in one place, but I haven't been able to authenticate it, that there is actually a portrait of Edward Everett in a historical museum in Greece. I cannot attest to that as being something that I've seen in any number of places, but I have seen it at least once. After he gets his PhD, he returns to Harvard, 1819. And an interesting thing, I gave this talk once before. Edward Everett is actually connected to the town of Plymouth as well, because in 1820, the town of Plymouth wanted to celebrate its bicentennial, and they got this gentleman by the name of Daniel Webster to come and deliver the speech. Daniel Webster came by stagecoach from Boston to Plymouth along what I guess is Route 3A, the town that runs through Situate, Cohasset, and Duxbury. It was an all-day trip. And on that stage with Daniel Webster was a man named George Ticknor, Ticknor. And Ticknor is a man given credit for changing the curriculum at Harvard from being primarily a school to teach ministers to being a school of higher education. What Ticknor and Webster spoke about, we have no idea. But it's important, as I will get to in a minute. In the course of his trip, we believe, we being historians, believe that the name of Edward Everett came up because one of the people on that stage was a woman named Davis and a woman named Russell. And the Davis and Russell families are very prominent in Plymouth. And so both of these women recorded some bits and pieces of the conversation. And it is believed that Webster learned of Edward Everett there. Had never met him. But by 1821, Webster and Edward Everett have formed a kind of association, of friendship. Webster gets himself elected to the House of Representatives, and he wants to deliver, in November of 1822, he wants to deliver a speech that everybody's going to remember. The Greeks are fighting for their independence in 1821 and 1822, and so Webster decides he's going to deliver it on Greek independence and the values of ancient Greece. But he doesn't know anything about Greece. So he contacts Daniel Webster. He contacts Edward Everett. And Everett, we assume, fills him in because I'm not going to bore you with what he talked about, but his speech was on independence. 3 years later, in November of 1823, the town of Plymouth wants someone to speak at the Forefathers Monument. That if you've ever been to Plymouth, you know it's big, huge granite structure that's there, to which I believe Abraham Lincoln contributed $5.
$10.
$10 to the building of it. They wanted Webster to go, but Webster couldn't show up, so they asked Edward Everett to come. Everett comes. Starting in 1825, and I'll just go through some of the things that Edward Everett does. He spends the next 33 years pretty much in public service. From 1825 to 1836, he's elected and re-elected to Congress as a representative from Massachusetts. He develops a reputation as being a major orator. And if you don't know anything about the 19th century, orators didn't cheat like I do. I have a cheat sheet here with all this information. They would get a topic, they would deliver a speech, and they would memorize the whole speech. And then they would just stand up and deliver it, and people would be judged by how well they stuck to whatever the topic was, and how factual it was, and how good the delivery was. 1836 to 1839, after having been in the House of Representatives, he comes back to Massachusetts and is elected governor of the state of Massachusetts. Now that's important because he begins to make suggestions that will result in being reforms to the educational system of the state of Massachusetts. He is the man who proposes and gets passed, this is Edward Everett, a law that says that all children under the age of 15 are mandated to spend 3 months in day school at least for 1 year. And that was quite a statement, because you have to remember, we're talking at a time when the whole world is agricultural. And so you want every male, every pair of hands at harvest season not in school. But he got this passed through. He also was instrumental in creating a board of state education, and I believe he was instrumental, and Tom can speak to this, to establishing what they call the normal schools, which were the first colleges, and Bridgewater State was one of those colleges. So he had a major impact there. 1840, 1841, he goes back to Europe, spends a year touring Europe. 1841, William Henry Harrison appoints Edward Everett to be the ambassador to Great Britain. So now he has been a congressman, and he has been a governor, and now he's appointed to being the ambassador. And as a result, he helped settle the border dispute that existed between Great Britain and the United States on the border of Canada. The Ashburton Treaty, I believe, was signed at that time. 1846 to 49, he becomes president of Harvard. He is the man who first says we should allow black men to enter Harvard if they meet the requirements. So he was instrumental in doing that. He increased the Harvard's endowment by giving speeches. 1850, he is appointed, when Daniel Webster is appointed Secretary of State by Millard Fillmore, he asks Everett to be his assistant. And when Daniel Webster dies, Edward Everett becomes the Secretary of State of the United States. And of course, the topic in the 1850s is slavery. And Edward Everett had very strong feelings about slavery. It was the polarizing political discussion of that era. From 1855 to 1858, Edward Everett, after he stepped down from being new president, steps down as being the Secretary of State. And there is reason to believe, I left this out, there is reason to believe that Edward Everett was instrumental in getting Commodore Perry to go into Japan. I think that was 1853, but I can't attest to that. I've read it somewhere. He spends 1855 to 1858 crisscrossing the country, delivering speeches on nationalism, on patriotism, on the character of George Washington, and he begins a campaign to try and help the ladies of Mount Vernon preserve George Washington's home. And he crisscrosses the country giving the same speech, never accepting any remittance. He delivered it 129 times, and he turned over to the ladies in 1858 $69,064, which I have a feeling in 1868 it was a real $69,064, not what our currency is today. And then, of course, his, I don't know if you want to call it a crowning achievement or whatever, but Abraham Lincoln is asked to deliver a speech commemorating the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. And that speech is delivered in November, I believe November 11th. I'm not sure of the date, but I believe it's in November. 19th, November 19th. Well, that was late. And the reason that they had the commemorative speech and dedication at that time is because Abraham Lincoln was not the keynote speaker. Edward Everett was the keynote speaker. And when they contacted Everett, Everett said, they contacted him much earlier, months earlier. He said, I haven't prepared the speech and I haven't learned the speech. And in this painting that's over here by Mort Kunstler, Edward Everett is this man right here. Very, very distinguished looking gentleman. But anyway, Edward Everett was the man who was going to give the keynote speech. And everybody knows, I think, that they asked Lincoln to deliver a few appropriate remarks. And of course, that's the Gettysburg Address, which is probably the single most significant piece of oration in the history of the United States. And there was a time in school where all kids had to learn it, and everybody knows 7 years ago, and so forth and so on. Edward Everett spoke for 2 hours. Abraham Lincoln spoke for 2 minutes. And at the end, Edward Everett said to Abraham Lincoln, he wrote him a note, and he said, quote, "I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." So he Everett recognized that what Lincoln had said was inspirational, monumental, whatever you want to call it. And that what he said would long be forgotten, and it has been. When Lincoln ran for re-election, Edward Everett was one of his strongest supporters. Again, crisscrossed the country. He dies in November 11th, 1956. Now, let's get back to East Bridgewater, okay? How did Edward Everett ever enter into the realm of the town of East Bridgewater? Well, first of all, East Bridgewater didn't exist. It was the East Parish of Bridgewater. And it was common in the 1810, 1820s for students who were in colleges and universities to take the months of January and February off in New England. Guess why? No. There's no central heating in the dormitories, so kids tended to go home. Now, the kids with less money did something that they called keeping country schools. They were out to the communities where they taught school for what was generally supposed to be a 7-week term. Well, Edward Everett came to the parish of East Bridgewater in 1810. He taught in a school. I'll tell you exactly where the building is and who owns it. He taught in a school with 70 boys and girls, some of whom were older than him. Some of these students were actually adults who had an interest in gaining an education. But he was there, supposed to be there for 7 weeks. He wound up staying, I believe, for 10 or 12 weeks. And the only thing he ever said that's been recorded about the time he was teaching in the East Parish of Bridgewater was, when it was over, I was heartily glad to return to Harvard. Well, I have a sneaking suspicion the children of East Bridgewater may have run him through the ringer, but as only children can do. He taught in a school that is today the Kozlowski Farmhouse at 1120 Central Street. Let's see, I've got the date here. The house was sold by the town of East Bridgewater. The house was sold to a woman named Heede, Heede. She turned around and sold it to her brother, Mr. Kozlowski. He took the house and moved it. If you go past the big field where Kozlowski Farm is, you come to the intersection with a set of lights. There's a Cumberland Farms on your left. Directly across from there is that Washington Street, I believe? Yeah. In that corner area is where the school was. The school was then moved, if you go across the street to where the Cumberland Farms is, and then come up Central Street, I believe 2 houses or 1 house. There is a white farmhouse. They took the building, which faced this way on Washington Street, and they turned it, or vice versa. It faced this way on Washington. They turned it and moved it, probably with horses on rollers, across the street and up the street, probably about 200 yards, and that's where the house stayed. When I first did the research on this, and Mrs. Kozlowski was still alive, this was done in the 70s or 80s, I actually interviewed her, and she swore that the woodshed that was out back, which I have in a DVD that I made, was the actual outhouse of the original farmhouse that was there. But at any rate, the point is that Edward Everett, this man of much accomplishment, came to the parish of East Bridgewater to teach for what was supposed to be 7 weeks, and I think it was doubled to 14. You could extend the time if you needed the money. So he was directly connected here, and he is the man who actually delivers the major address at Gettysburg. And most people have no idea of that, and most people have no knowledge that it was ever even in the town of East Bridgewater. Thank you.
We are going to,
One more
Yes.
point. In 1870, there was a section of Charlestown, Massachusetts, that had been turned over to Malden, Massachusetts. And then people who lived in the area in between they said they wanted to create their own city, and they named it after Edward Everett. So the city of Everett is named after Edward Everett. That was done in 1870. Today, the city of Everett has over 50,000 people in it. And as a matter of fact, if you're on Southeast Expressway and you're going into Boston, somewhere right around the gas tank, old exit number 4, there's a big sign that says Edward Everett Square. Bear right. Yeah. So he's there. All yours.
we're going to, if there is any quick questions for Rui in regards directly to his talk, we are gonna have a brief question and answer period with all 3 of us at the end. But if there's anything in particular about Edward Everett that you want to ask right now before we dismiss him,
Got a question. Edwards, when he was representative of Massachusetts at the time,
Uh-huh.
do you know what district
I
that
do
he
not.
represented?
My guess is it would have been somewhere in Boston, in the greater Boston area. I didn't look that up. As I said, this research that I did was 20 years ago, and then I did a talk in 2012, I believe, in the town of Plymouth. And I have a lot of notes. I brought 2 folders with me and left 3 at home. Oh, by the way, Edward Everett was able to do all this public service because he married well. He married into the Brooks family, and Mr. Brooks was a maritime insurance agent when we had a lot of maritime commerce coming out of Massachusetts. And he gladly supported Edward Everett in all his endeavors. And I've gone through this stuff kind of hurriedly, leaving out what he accomplished when he was in the House of Representatives, when he was a senator, and so on, because I've taken more time than I should have. But he's a remarkable man.
Is he buried here?
He's buried in Dorchester, I believe. Yeah. He is buried in this area. And one of the side notes of history that people, you're supposed to know about little innuendo things. At Gettysburg, when he was giving the speech, at the time, he was suffering from a urinary tract infection. And so they had to set up a little tent behind the stage so he could go and relieve himself. at least twice while he was giving the speech. He was an old man.
First
He will,
TB.
yeah. He will die within 2 years. But he was a brilliant guy, that's all. That's enough.
Thank you, Rui. As we talked about, we have our Civil War Roundtable, and one of the inspirations for that was I got to hear Rui. He taught my kids and stuff, and actually he came to East Bridgewater just as I was leaving the school system. But I got to know him pretty well when he did this same program, similar, for the East Bridgewater Historical Society at the time downstairs in the selectman's office. And he wore the Edward Everett suit, and I got just a big kick out of that. And I was almost inspired tonight to wear one of my Civil War uniforms, but after that unfortunate shooting of a musket yesterday, up there, I don't know if you saw that on the news, but a bullet right through. They're indoors. They were practicing their drills, and the gun went off. And I said, "Well, I don't think I'll wear my uniform. Plus it's warm up here too." One thing of note, I'm looking at the picture there of the First Parish Church, now the Grace Bible Church, where we had our kickoff, and I never realized it, but on one of the pews there is a gold plaque, and it said, "This is where Edward Everett sat." So it's kind of cool. And he actually shared a gold plaque with this gentleman, who is Francis David Millett, when he was a drummer boy, before he drowned on the Titanic, of course. But he has a gold plaque on one of the pews there, too. It's a little historic things of, to me, great interest. I just get a big kick out of it. And when we did the kickoff, you know, we walked in there, and I see the plaques, and I'm like, well, who are these for? And I'm looking back. I said, wow, that was very, very interesting. So, and one other thing of note, we got to record it, though, and I'm sure a lot of you out there are going, it's not Kozlowski, it was a Kominiski family farm. I'm sure, and we have Kozlowskis with the farm, but of course, you know, I know any of our local folks are going to be saying, no, that's a Kominiski farm. Other than that, I'm going to grade you a 89.7. So, he was tough on my kids. Upcoming on April 22nd, as we continue to try to do, we're trying to shoot for at least one activity a month as we go through the entire year. On April 22nd, though, at St. John's Church across the way, the East Bridgewater Clergy Association is putting on a program called Stories, Music, and Desserts. And it's going to be talking about the historic churches in East Bridgewater. I'm looking forward to that. It's a Saturday night, so come on over to that one. And on April 25th at the center at Sachem Rock, we have Michael Tugas, I hope I'm pronouncing it right. He's the author who wrote, I always forget the name of the book, about the storm down in Chatham where they rescued the people. It became a movie. But he's going to be talking, what was it called? The Finest Hours, direct from the book club. Thank you, Terry. Terry and Richard, were you two at some of the original meetings with us? I sort of thought. I'm sitting back there. But pretty close. Pretty close. We appreciate all the work you do with us. But he's going to be doing a talk on King Philip's War, which is quite appropriate because one of the first buildings in East Bridgewater is in the front corner of the Sachem Rock Farm, and that was burned by the Native Americans during the King Philip's War. So that should be a good night. Looking forward to it. Okay, our next speaker is a man who needs no introduction, unless you don't know him. Then we'll introduce him. Tom Turner, here from town for, well, last couple of years, raised his family here and so on. He was a professor at Bridgewater State University, and he held on just long enough because he always wanted to teach at a university, so he just stayed at the teacher's school until it became a university. He taught there from 1971 to 2010, and then part-time from 2010 to 2019, and that's what, 45? 48 years altogether. He gets him, I call him Tom, but when I want to embarrass him, I call him Dr. Turner. He's very well known, makes him blush, actually. He's like, don't call me doctor. very well-known authority on the Lincoln assassination, published several books, some pretty good ones too. I enjoyed reading a few. And he's just been such an addition to our roundtable because we're looking for that information on Lincoln or a lot of things from that time period. Tom's the man. So, Tom Turner.
Yeah, Rui taught my kids as well, so he did generations here. I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about Lincoln. I think they put me between Dale and Rui because they have a more direct connection with East Bridgewater, but I do have a connection with East Bridgewater in the end. And it used to be claimed that Abraham Lincoln didn't know much about his ancestry, and of course his ancestry is here in Massachusetts. Samuel Lincoln came to Hingham and Mordecai Lincoln in Situate. There are still some buildings and so forth there with it. But more recently, a historian, Michael Burlingame, in his two-volume, 2,000 pages, it's kind of the definitive Lincoln biography in a way, found this, and to quote Lincoln, "I believe the first of our ancestors we know anything about was Samuel Lincoln, who came from Norwich, England, in 1638. Now, he got the date wrong. It was 1637, but he's relying certainly on family tradition when he said that, and settled in a small Massachusetts place called Hingham, or it might have been Hangham. You know Lincoln did like wordplay and jokes and that type of thing. And the minute I saw that, I always thought, I grew up in Quincy, and my father, I used to ride with him through Hingham. He always used to say, Hingham, Hangham, choke 'em. He didn't realize he was using Lincoln humor, and I guarantee you Lincoln isn't the originator of that. I think we could probably find others as well. So Lincoln did know his ancestry. He was familiar with it, and he did tell another person he was going to go to England when he left the presidency and maybe do more research. Of course, unfortunately, with the assassination, he didn't get there. He did, however, come here in 1848, and the reason he came in 1848, he was campaigning for Zachary Taylor, who was the Whig candidate. Lincoln was a Whig, and the problem for the Whigs was that, one, Zachary Taylor was a slave owner, and there was some fear that might hurt him in Massachusetts, plus the fact Martin Van Buren, who'd been president and had only lasted one term, but he was running again for the Free Soil Party, and there was a fear that he might take away votes and the Democrats might actually win. So Lincoln arrived in Worcester in 1848, and the local Whigs, none of them wanted to speak at the convention, but they saw Lincoln get off the train and found out he was a Whig, and they asked, would you speak to the convention? So Lincoln agreed that he would do that. There's many descriptions of Lincoln on the stump in Massachusetts. A writer in Cambridge described him as, quote, a capital specimen of a sucker Whig, 6 feet at least in his stockings, and every way worthy to represent the Spartan band of the only Whig district in poor, benighted Illinois. His speech was called plain, direct, convincing, a model speech for the campaign. One of the people who heard Lincoln speak was a man named Henry Gardner, who eventually became governor of Massachusetts. And he said this: no one had ever heard him on the stump, and in fact knew anything about him. When he was announced, his tall, angular, bent form and his manifest awkwardness and low tone of voice promised nothing interesting, but soon he warmed to his work. His style and manner of speaking were novelties in the East. He repeated anecdotes, told stories, admirable in humor and in point, interspersed with bursts of true eloquence which constantly brought down the house. His sarcasm of Cass Van Buren and the Democratic Party was inimitable, and whenever he attempted to stop, the shouts of go on, were deafening. He probably spoke over an hour, but so great was the enthusiasm, time could not be measured. It was doubtless one of the best efforts of his life. Lincoln's manner of speaking certainly was a novelty in the East, and you'll see this from another description here. George Monroe described his appearance in Dedham. He wore a black alpaca sack, and he turned up the sleeves of this and then the cuffs of his shirt. Next, he loosened his tie, and soon after, he took the necktie off altogether. And you can imagine how that might have gone on with the very proper New Englanders. What's happening here. All the time, however, he was gaining on his audience. He soon had it by a spell. His style was the most familiar and offhand possible. His eyes lighted up and changed the whole expression of his countenance. He began to bubble out with humor, but the chief charm in the address lay in the homely way he made his points. There was no attempt at eloquence or finish of style, but for plain pungency of humor, it would have been difficult to surpass his speech. In Dedham, the excitement that he generated is also quite clear. When he said he had to go to Cambridge because he had another speaking engagement there were cries of, no, don't go, stay, please stay on. And one individual said, I'll hook up my team to a wagon, I'll drive you there, because they wanted to hear him continue. But Lincoln, however, finally said, I have agreed to go to Cambridge, and I must be there. I came here as I agreed, and I'm going there the same way. And with that, he dashed off to the railroad depot. Now, I don't want to give you the impression that the speeches he gave made a good impression on everyone, because they didn't. And here's a very scathing one from the Taunton newspaper. It's a Democratic newspaper. And it said the speaker was far inferior as a reasoner to others who hold the same views, but then he was more unscrupulous, more facetious with his sneers. He mixed up a great deal of humor. So, again, politics like now, similar then, depending on your point of view here with it. A lot of the buildings associated with Lincoln, and he did speak in Taunton, so he came fairly close to East Bridgewater. In fact, he did give a couple of speeches there. A lot of the buildings are gone, but one that still stands, if you've ever been out to Sturbridge Village, the building where he gave the speech at the convention, that was moved out there. So there is a Lincoln building that still does, in fact, exist. Henry Gardner, again, who would become governor, recalling the dinner that was held afterwards, said, Lincoln kept very quiet, although inevitably there was some good-natured joking about whether Abraham and Levi Lincoln were related, and it was the Levi Lincoln house. Levi Lincoln was another governor. They were related. They didn't know it, though. I'm not sure they ever knew it. Lincoln finally said, I hope we both belong, as the Scotch say, to the same clan, but I know that is one thing, we are both good Whigs, so that would have to suffice that they were the same political party. Now, interestingly enough, Gardner visited the White House when Lincoln became president in 1861. And if you don't think of Abraham Lincoln as a good politician, you certainly will from this incident, because Lincoln greeted Gardner, you and I are no strangers. We dined together at Governor Lincoln's in 1848. 12 years later, Lincoln remembers this, like it's yesterday. And he did have a knack for recalling events and names and this type of thing. He then added, yes, I had been chosen to Congress from the Wild West, and with hayseed in my hair, I went to Massachusetts, the most cultured state in the Union, to take a few lessons in deportment. So I always like that with the hayseed in the hair. There was a grand dinner, a superb dinner, by far the finest I ever saw in my life, and the great men who were there too. Why, I can tell you just how they were arranged at table. And Gardner said, without missing a beat, he began at one end and mentioned the names in order, and I verily believe without the admission of a single one. How many of us can do that, after a dozen years? But Lincoln did have the capability of doing that. His last appearance in Massachusetts was at Tremont Temple in Boston. But of course, he wasn't the featured speaker. It was Governor William Seward of New York. Governor Seward was much better known. He always had hankerings to be president. So people who came, certainly were there more for what Seward would say. Ironically, however, again, 12 years later, it's really Lincoln who wrests the Republican nomination from Seward, and sort of reminds me in a way of, if you think of Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. Certainly Hillary Clinton was better known than Barack Obama, but the same type of thing happened. I will say Lincoln had generated some interest, though, because people were clamoring in various parts of the state. We would like to hear Mr. Lincoln speak. However, the Boston Atlas ran this piece, which said, "Honorable Abraham Lincoln, in answer to the many applications which we daily receive from different parts of the state for this gentleman to speak, we have to say that he left Boston on Saturday morning on his way home to Illinois." So he could have had some other speaking engagements, and he did have quite a few, but he did return home. Now, he did come one other time to Massachusetts, and that was after his Cooper Union speech in 1860. He delivered that famous speech in New York. That's often called the speech that made Lincoln president. Again, with an Eastern audience, but he really had quite an impact. Although, again, Lincoln had some troubles because he was a Westerner. If you've ever seen movies of Abraham Lincoln, he's often portrayed by actors with a very deep bass voice. Lincoln had a high soprano voice. People noticed it. Yeah, it was almost soprano. And he used to say things like, "Mr. Chairman," for chairman. So sometimes when he started speaking, his speech patterns or whatever would turn people off. And in fact, at Cooper Union, one individual said, "Old fellow, you won't do. That's all very well for the Wild West, but it'll never go down in New York." However, by the end of the speech, the same person shouted like a wild Indian and proclaimed that Lincoln was the greatest man since St. Paul. So he did have that ability to bring people around. Now, what he did also after that, he decided that he would take a trip up to New Hampshire, and you might wonder why he would go there. But his son Robert was studying at Phillips Exeter. And I have to tell you, Robert wanted to go to Harvard. He took the 16 entrance exams and he flunked 15. So he wasn't going to Harvard right away. So he did go to Phillips Exeter, kind of a prep school, to try and prepare. And don't feel too badly for Robert. He eventually did get into Harvard, and he eventually became a lawyer, and he was head of the Pullman Company and fairly substantially wealthy. But in any case, it allowed Lincoln to speak other places in New England. I sometimes do a little bit longer version of this, but he spoke in Rhode Island. He did get up to Connecticut as well, he spoke, and he did get up to New Hampshire. And he spoke at Manchester, Exeter, Concord, and Dover. And again, I have to tell you, even some of Robert's friends were at first recorded as not being impressed. One boy apparently whispered while Lincoln was speaking, "Don't you feel kind of sorry for Bob?" While a female student said, "Isn't it too bad Bob's got such a homely father?" However, the usual reaction, once he spoke, they were, "Oh, okay, maybe we shouldn't judge that way so much." Now, one thing I do have to say, no matter how much you know about a topic, there's always something to learn. I always say that to my students. If you want certainty, study math. 1 + 1 always equals 2, right? Although I actually studied a kind of math, Boolean math, where 1 + 1 = 1. It had something to do with computers, but so maybe I was being a little overboard with it. But basically, if you study history, there's controversy and there's new facts. And I did talk on this. My daughter Jen worked up in Haverhill at the Buttonwoods, their Haverhill Historical Society, and not a big audience like tonight either. I think we only had about 4 people. And afterwards, one of them came up, and it was kind of with COVID, and he had a mask on. Turned out I knew him. I'd been on the Civil War Bicentennial with him. Oh, Joe, how are you? And he said, "Did you ever hear about Lincoln in Lawrence?" And no, I'm not familiar with that. I'm familiar with him a lot of places. And what happened was in those days, the train, if you went from Manchester back to Exeter, it came back through Massachusetts. That was the route. Now, if he just came through Lawrence, that's one thing, but he had to make a connection. And so he had to wait several hours, and he sent a letter to Mary, which exists, and that's where you can get this information. In fact, he mentioned to her the Pemberton Mill disaster, and one of the worst industrial disasters in American history. The Pemberton Mill collapsed, and that trapped some people and whatever. And then, because they were looking for victims at night, somebody had a lantern and dropped it, and the whole rest of it went up, killed somewhere between 85 and 145 people. And it tells you, record keeping and trying to get at it in that day and age. So that's something I never knew until a couple of years ago here. So his history is always new and changing. Now, Lincoln did pass through Massachusetts in 1860, but all he did was to get off the train at the South Station area, just like today, the train's not connected, walked across Boston Common, and then took the train north. And he was asked to speak in Massachusetts. Seward was very popular here. There was no governor's race, so he didn't really see any reason to do that. And I do have to tell you, in 1960, my mentor at Boston University, Professor Ken Bernard, and Claude Simmons, a member of the Lincoln Group of Boston, decided we'll reenact Lincoln's crossing of Boston Common. So Claude Simmons dressed up just like Rui, and Professor Bernard got a pad of paper, and he was all set and following along. And I don't think poor Professor Bernard ever got over it, because the only comments he seemed to get was, "Who's that tall hippie dressed in black, and who is this guy following behind with a pad of paper?" So I just had that sense that he never did get over that particular trauma there. Now, the last point I will make, and it is a Lincoln connection here with East Bridgewater, and if you are sitting there anticipating, I'm going to tell you that with my diligent research, I discovered Lincoln on his way to Taunton, walked through East Bridgewater. I'm not going to tell you that. He was never here, as far as I know. However, I think some of you do know, to this day, we still have 2 post offices, right, in East Bridgewater, the major post office downtown and the post office in Elmwood. And that, in fact, was chartered by Abraham Lincoln on July 1st, 1861. And if we know anything about the history of East Bridgewater had a lot of industry, didn't it? Yeah, very industrial town. And one of the big industries was shoes. And the Civil War had broken out, and they put the post office there so they would then be able to ship the shoes directly from Elmwood. And I'd like to know more about it. I don't know if there is more to know about it, but who told Lincoln about, small, very small town then, East Bridgewater, and, they'd have the shoes and all of that. And to this day, we still have that post office. Many cities are down to having one post office, right? And we've still got the second. So that is definitely a Lincoln connection here. And we've talked a little bit on the Bicentennial committee that, and I have to confess, I've never been in there, but people tell me it's not marked or anything. I don't think there's any plaques on the wall, so maybe that would be a worthy project for the Bicentennial Committee to undertake. So we'll see how that goes. But thank you.
All right, I'm gonna remove this here, and I forgot to tell you, this is a gift to the town of East Bridgewater. It's to be hopefully hung up in the library at the high school, and with a story under it to be, to explain what Edward Everett coming to East Bridgewater, you know, in that connection, because it is very, very, very unique. And somebody who obviously has too many paintings hanging in his house is Rui is donating this to the town of East Bridgewater. So, thank you, Rui. Rui said when he came in and saw all the people, he said, maybe we should pass the hat. Well, he got the hat for it. It's so great to see everybody. Plus, I need that space for this particular posting. I am going to talk a little bit about East Bridgewater and the Civil War. I got a few reference things here. I'll pick them up. When we break at the end of the program, there was some paperwork up here. If you want to take notes, there's a lot of good stuff online that you can find out about some of the material that we have here. So, I'm hoping that we got plenty of snacks and stuff to go after I'm done chatting, and hope you sit back and relax and enjoy and talk with us, because one thing that Civil War people seem to have in common is they just love to talk. I don't know if you ever been to a battlefield, and generally it goes this way. It's the wife is sitting in the car and overheating in Gettysburg in July. And 2 or 3 kids are yanking at each other. The father's out there. There's another father with him. And it just goes that way. And you know, I used to read those jokes, and then I started going to some of those battlefields, and it's exactly what happened. A lot of serious pointing goes on. East Bridgewater did its fair share. We had a town, and again, if I throw out numbers that aren't totally correct, but I've heard anywhere from 2,400 people in town at the beginning of the hostilities to maybe close to 3,000. And those numbers are available. A number I do know for sure is that we sent about 370 to 380 boys and men off to the war. And if you do the math, you know, you got to figure each one of them had a wife or a mother or a sister or a brother. So this war touched everybody. When we started the Bicentennial committee, we wanted to have a symbol, and I have the symbol on the front of the. Oh, it's gone. That old duct tape. Let's see if it sticks. This is, of course, the Civil War monument. It's called the Soldiers Monument, and that was what we picked for the kind of the centerpiece for the celebration. And you'll be seeing that, you know, over the next couple of months. People have asked. I just actually saw it on Facebook, that there's 47 names on the monument, and they said, is that the amount of people that went to the war? I said, no, that's the amount that didn't come home. And stop and think, 47 boys gone, but not forgotten. And when they left the town, they left here in May. The war started in April, and they were off in May. And the problem was they got into a group called like the 1st Regiment, the 2nd Regiment. And then they went to Virginia, and there was a lot of confusion. They actually went to Boston, and when they get in there, the adjutant general, now these guys left East Bridgewater at the train station to a big party. All the wives came out, the girls, they're waving their handkerchiefs, they made them a flag, and everything was looking pretty good. They got to Boston after this royal send-off, and the adjutant general came out and said, well, sorry, but you signed up for 90 days, and we want 3 years. Oh. They all turned around and came home to East Bridgewater. And they said, think about it, because we can't take you the way you signed up. They came back, and almost, I think, all but 3 of them re-signed for the 3 years. And a lot of them went the entire 4 years of the war. As I said, 47 wouldn't return. The biggest group we had was a group that became the 29th Mass. Now, doing the numbers, they started the first mass, second, and so on. So the 29th seems like it was a little bit later, but in reality, they were one of the oldest of the groups. And has anybody noticed the flag of the 29th Massachusetts? It's here in the room. Don't you move an inch. That's the one. That there is a hand-painted replica of the original flag of the 29th Massachusetts. They actually went through 3 of them because they got so shot up on the battlefield, because they used the flags not only as their sign of honor, but they went into battle carrying the flag so that their men could see. That's the way they lined up. They had guidons on the ends. They had the big flags, the national flag and the state flag. And if you look at that closely, you'll see that it's basically the flag of Massachusetts now. It has all the same earmarks, the Indian, the Native American, the single star, the sword on the very top, and so on. And then it has our motto, which is written in Latin. Does anybody know what it means? I can never decipher it correctly, but it's something to do with, by the sword we seek liberty, but only, somehow we seek liberty, but only, if not under the sword. I should have it written down because it sounds much better if you know what you're saying, but it's still the same, it's still the same one, you know. You can, I'm sure someone's got their computer out now and they're looking it up, but it's still the same saying there. It has something to do with liberty, but we're going to do it if we have to fight for it. We'll do it. Yeah, that's the way that it was. So we've studied this 29th Massachusetts. Quite an interesting bunch of fellows. Quite a few very interesting stories. We actually had 3 members of the 29th. One of them was from East Bridgewater, and carrying the flags into battle was a great honor. It was a tremendous honor. And the flag bearer generally was a sergeant. And in this particular case, the sergeant had been sick. So somebody filling in for him was going to carry the flag. Well, all of a sudden the day of the battle comes, and this guy from East Bridgewater, you know, was all set to carry the flag into battle for the first time. And the other flag bearer, the senior flag bearer, came out of sick leave and said, nope, that's my flag. And it went right to the colonel of the regiment. They argued about it. So he said, no, you've been out sick. He said, he's going to carry the flag. So he carried it, and he was shot down dead immediately. The senior flag bearer jumped to the flag and pulled it up, and he was shot dead immediately. And then the 3rd sergeant, which is part of the color guard, he grabbed it, and he died immediately, all 3 right on top of each other. And these, you know, you see this stuff in Hollywood, and you say, wow, that's stuff like that didn't really happen, but it did happen. They came here for a reunion. They brought the pictures of the 3 color guard bearers and told the story. Very, very interesting. Another thing about the 29th that I found unique was the commander of Company C, which was our 100 men from East Bridgewater, was 59 years old when he went into the war, and he was the leader. And the younger boys they'd come to a little hill, and they'd come up behind him and kind of hold him by the elbow and help him up the hill. And you know, you can't make this stuff up. So it was very, very interesting. Back in I can't remember when we started it. About the same time that you quit teaching here. Yeah. And we did what we call the Frank Harlow Day, which was a celebration of one of the soldiers in our in the 29th, who we're going to be talking about, obviously. But we got together up at Sachem Rock, and it was before the senior center was rebuilt. It was still Dr. Bannerman's property, or the town had recently bought it. And we did a reenactment, and we did it in tribute to this one particular soldier. And then we did it for 11 more years. And again, I will talk about that. But I found this folder today, and it's kind of cool because it just explains, you know, how important this was to the town. And what it says here is, when the Civil War began in April of 1861, East Bridgewater jumped into action. They voted to support the war and to raise and fund a company of volunteers that was ready to go by the middle of May. with a population of, this is 3,200, East Bridgewater would have 365 men answer the call, and 48 would never come home. There are 47 names on the monument. There's a rumor, though, that there was a 48th name that's not on there, so that might be something we can fix up, too. Also, it says, 3 generations of reenactors portray the soldiers of the 29th. Frank Harlow on the left, the last casualty from East Bridgewater. Captain Lebbeus Leach, who at the age of 59 commanded Company C, and Lieutenant Elisha Holbrook, who died of disease in August of 1861, making him East Bridgewater's first casualty. And he never left Massachusetts. He died of disease or something at the training camp on the other side of Boston. But still, you know, a veteran, he wouldn't have been there if he wasn't going off to the war. But I get a big kick out of it because I noticed on the monument, those 2 names are together, Harlow, and of course, being alphabetical, you have Holbrook right there with him, and it's the first and the last, so it's kind of appropriate. And then, the next paragraph here, and this is a great one. I should have Rose up at Happy Frog reprint it because it was pretty neat. It was quite a nice event. But we have the women of town. And everybody forgets them. Everybody wants the glory of running off to battle, waving a sword and shooting the muskets. But the women in town did real duty here. And what we wrote about them is the women in town were equally patriotic. Not only did they keep the home fires burning, they also stepped up to do the work needed to be done with so many men away from home. Several women's aid societies were formed to support the soldiers. Homemade goods were sent to the appreciative soldiers throughout the war. And they actually had these societies for many years after the war to assist with those soldiers that came back, broken, missing limbs. It was really quite a terrible war when you get right down to it. They estimate now, it used to be 600,000, but now they're pretty sure it's closer to 750,000 people died during those 4 years. You know, it's something to think about, that's for sure. So, what I want to talk about in particular, and it's just kind of it's a funny story, I've been telling it for quite a while. It is kind of the basis for my reenacting and having the Civil War Roundtable and just having a general interest. I started studying the Civil War during the Bicentennial, which was, of course, 1961. And I got to see a reenactment out at the thing they called the Big E, well, they call it the Big E now, but it was the Eastern States Exposition. And they did a reenactment of the Battle of Philippi, which was the first ground battle of the war on June 3rd of 1861. But they did it in a stadium. And you know, the stadiums where the football players come running out, well, that's where the cavalry came riding out. And the other end, the doors open and the infantry come running out. And they had paper houses in the middle of the football field. And they waged a battle, and they started burning the houses, and it was quite an event. And I think I was 10 years old, and I just thought that was the greatest thing. Well, fortunately, my folks like to humor me anyways, and they said, so what do you want to do next? I said, the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg is going to occur in 1963, so we went there. And for me, now 12 years old, to be there and to be part of that and to see, you know, President Eisenhower, because he bought a farm there, and that's where he lived after being president, George Wallace from Alabama, everybody was there, all the politicians, reenactors galore, parades, reenactments of the battle. So it was really, really the beginning of a lifelong study for me. And I always joke with these guys because these two are as professional as we know. And I was never a professional. I didn't do, you know, I didn't go to college. I didn't study to be a historian. But I like to just think of myself as someone who just enjoys the Civil War and enjoys not the killing, but just the history of it, the politics and all that stuff, because it's just so much to learn. So flash forward about 20 years ago, I'm sitting up here at my house. If you don't know where I live, it's just on the other side of the Mitchell School. And I'm reading a book, and it's called The Last Full Measure by Jeffrey Shara, whose father wrote The Killer Angels, which became the movie Gettysburg. And I'm flipping through, and I come to this episode about this battle in Petersburg, Virginia. It was called the Battle of Fort Stedman. And they said this was the last offensive of General Lee. The war's almost over. He's trying to break the siege of Petersburg, and he decides on this risky movement, you know. So I'm reading it, and I said, that's very unusual. I've read so many books. I have never heard of the Battle of Fort Stedman, ever. So I'm like, very interesting. So my wife comes in, and she said, we just had a new puppy. His name was Dixie. She said, hey, Dixie, you want to go for a walk? And I said, I'll go with you. So I set the book on the table, and I walked down the street here to the Grace Bible Church, down the hill into the old Central Cemetery. And this is the route I used to go to the intermediate school when I was a kid. And I've been on it, 1,000 times. And all of a sudden I looked up, and there was a monument that caught my eye, and I looked. And I said, there was just something about it drew me to it, and I walked up the hill to get to it. And on it, it had the name of a soldier, and it said he was killed at the Battle of Fort Stedman. Ever see the Twilight Zone? It's kind of like one of those, up and down my back. So I'm like, this is amazing. I said, how could that be that I've never heard of that? And now I find a kid buried in my backyard, basically, that was killed at the Battle of Fort Stedman. So, as we talked about the strange connections, later that summer, I'm down at the Boy Scout camp where I was working as with that troop here from town. And I brought a book with me called Specimen Days and Collect by Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman, of course, is the gentleman on the left there. And in it, he tells a story called A Yankee Antique. It's only about a page and a half long. And he describes this young soldier from Massachusetts who gave his who died at Fort Stedman. And then he says, after he died, he said his father came and took his body home to Plymouth County. So now this is Twilight Zone times 2. I'm like, this could not be the same person. So when I got back from the Boy Scout camp, I went rushing down to the cemetery with my book. And I discovered Calvin Francis Harlow. That's the gentleman there on the left. And there was just something about it that I just said, this is really amazing. Well, I was reenacting at the time, and I started talking to everybody, anyone that would listen. I got you all to come in tonight. So that's what you do when you got a subject. So I'm just so interested in this story and this guy, and it just, everybody was interested in it. They said, how do we not know about that? Well, I did a little research around, and Margaret Alexander, of course, we all remember Margaret, she told me that she was pretty sure that that was someone that her family had known here in town, and she put me in touch with a minister down in Harwich. And I called him on the phone, and I said, I'm looking for information on Calvin Francis Harlow. He said, oh, yeah. He said, I got some, his picture and stuff. And I said, we wanted to do something as a tribute to him. I said, Walt Whitman wrote a story about him. And he turned, he said, oh, yeah. He said, that's pretty famous in the family. I said, well, nobody up here seems to know about it, because anyone I asked, no one had heard of it, except Margaret said she thought she had heard of it. So I said, can you get a picture, because we'd love to have the picture. He said, I have one, I can make a copy and send it to you. So he sent me that copy there, and that graces the front of this. And we decided that we should have a celebration in his name. So I was talking again to this reverend, and he told me that some stories, and then out of the clear blue he said, oh, I have a bunch of his letters. Would you like those? And I'm like, well, gee. Golly gee. And they're reprints, but fortunately for me, if you ever tried to read a Civil War letter, somebody transposed them all, and so they're typed. So I have the original letter printed and then the typed version of it. And they're so interesting. He went in, he was 18 years old, and he went in and started off the war with the 29th. And he spent virtually the 4 years of the war with the 29th. The 29th was a unique group. They were a very, very Yankee collection. We had a group from They came from the Cape. We had a Plymouth organization. We had East Bridgewater. So these guys were like pilgrim stock. And who do you think they put them with to fight? The Irish Brigade. Exactly. That was a no-no back then. And they did it because the 28th Mass wasn't ready to go. And they were made up of mostly boys from Boston. So it would have been more appropriate for them to have gone in to the Irish Brigade. Well, they joined the Irish Brigade, they fought at the Battle of Antietam, and they fought so nobly that General Meagher wanted to give them the green flag. And they wanted them to carry it instead of the state flag. And the 29th Mass, the officials up at the top said, Next thing you know, they get shipped over to the Ninth Corps and they wind up out in Mississippi. So they missed Gettysburg, but they were out in Vicksburg and Jackson and just a lot of fighting out there. And then they came back here for the end of the war, and they fought in the wilderness. They fought in the Petersburg siege. They were at the Crater, if you've heard of that battle, when they blew the hole in the ground. And they also, in the earlier days, when they were in Virginia, they witnessed the Battle of the Monitor and the Merrimack. And they actually were sitting up on the heights looking down, firing their muskets at the two ships, and they were pinging the musket balls off of the metal ships. Again, another connection over in Bridgewater. There's a foundry over there, and they built some of the steel for the Monitor was made at that factory over there. So again, it's just another one of those connections. But he would go the whole war as a private, and it was just, very, very simple. He was a private, and towards the end of the war, just after the Battle of the Crater, the first sergeant of the unit was killed, and they made him the first sergeant. And that's the way that he'd die, as a first sergeant. Well, we did this tribute to him because I thought it was quite a story. In the first year that we did it, and Rui, you were there, we actually came in here because it was raining so hard outside. We had to do our program up here in this very room. And it was raining so bad that we just figured this is a loss. But everybody seemed to have enjoyed themselves. And the reenactors, if you ever met reenactors, they enjoy pain and suffering. They enjoy the rain. They like it when people come by, wow, you guys are tough, But so we said, well, let's do it again the next year. So the next year we did it, and I wanted to do this near the anniversary of the battle, which is March 25th, which of course is, this week coming up. And I wanted to stay with the March thing, so we did another one, and this time it not only rained, it snowed. And it was really something. It was quite an event. And the third year, I'm pretty sure we got just almost a good day, but it was still pretty rainy. So I was getting a little frustrated, but everybody seemed to want to keep doing it. They said, this is important, we should do this tribute. So out of the clear blue, my wife, most of you know Carol, I'm sure, she said, I think the problem, she says, if you keep calling him Calvin Francis Harlow, because that's such a beautiful old name. But all the letters, he signed them Frank. And all his uncle, his great uncle, he said that was my Uncle Frank. And we just said, wow, maybe we're calling him the wrong name because we don't know. His, Francis, who calls somebody Francis? Let's call him Frank. So that was the name he went by, and that's how he wanted to be remembered. So I said, all right, we've done Calvin Francis Harlow Day for 3 years. Let's switch it to Frank, see what happens. So switched it to Frank. And the sun came out. We had the most beautiful day down there, and everybody was happy, and it was just so nice. But so we continued it, like I said, for 11 years total. We did get a little more rain. Actually, when they started to build the senior center, we moved off that property and brought, I think, the last maybe 3 years. When did they build it? What year did they build it? 2011. Yeah, so that's just about the time I think we moved up to the common, just because of the construction. They didn't have those metal wire fences during the Civil War. They had like other things, so it didn't quite go with the pitches. So we said, we'll go up to the common. And I think we did 2 years on the common, and that was so nice too, because it was right there with the Civil War monument. And it kind of brought it all together. End of the story. Frank Harlow now, after serving, oh, that's all right. It's already done its duty. Frank Harlow, doing his duty, now a first sergeant, and if you've done military, the first sergeant is the highest ranking non-commissioned officer, and he's in charge of his company. He is woken in the night when this Battle of Fort Stedman takes place, about 2 o'clock in the morning. And what happened was the lines were so close together, and they were in this called Fort Stedman, which basically was a hole in the ground. It had some dugouts so that they could sleep at night. And they had batteries on each side. And the batteries would protect, shooting this way and that way. And the soldiers would be in these forts. It was Fort Stedman and Fort Haskell and Fort Damnation and Fort Hell, all the way down the line. General Lee said he had to get out of Petersburg. So he sent a General Gordon, John Gordon, to break through the line at Fort Stedman. The lines at that time were like 150 yards apart. And talk about trench warfare. These guys, you put your head up and boom, a shot would come flying right to you. So they had done this for months. But the Confederacy was running out of everything, and they were surrendering left and right. And they actually were so used to seeing the Confederates coming in that Lee sent this group with General Gordon, highly trained, and they just kind of ambled over and started breaking up the works. Basically, the Union troops are like, oh, they must be surrendering. But then all of a sudden, all hell broke loose. And these guys were surprised. They woke up, and he went right to his post. And a rebel captain came to him and said, surrender, and aimed a pistol. Harlow, in the rank of the first sergeant, he said, I never while I live. And it was useless because all his men around him were putting their guns down because they were just overwhelmed at this moment, just this moment. He said again, I will not surrender. So whatever happened, happened. They both fired their guns. They both killed each other, and they fell dead on top of each other, the captain and young Sergeant Harlow. Somehow, and this I don't know, this is one of those great mysteries, and any time that you study history, you're going to find there's more to it. I think Tom alluded to that you don't know. How Walt Whitman, who was, again, Walt Whitman's the eminent poet of our times at that time, amazing stuff that he did. How did Walt Whitman find out about Frank Harlow? He wrote that beautiful story, which again is, like I said, it's a Specimen Days and Collect. It's under the title A Yankee Antique. And if you read it, you'll just be really touched because of the poetry that he uses talking about this young, brave man who wouldn't surrender. And said, it's just too much after 4 years of fighting. I'm not going to surrender. Unfortunately, or fortunately, the Union on both sides just turned around once they saw what was happening and retook the fort within 15 or 20 minutes. And it was over. And he had died uselessly. I don't know. He just couldn't surrender, so he didn't. And the connection, to me, with, Walt Whitman is incredible. As a matter of fact, just a little weird things, but Frank Harlow grew up on Whitman Street, and I always just got a kick out of that. I said, that's kind of weird. His house still stands. If you know where the Jehovah's Witness, the Kingdom Hall was, it's a yellow house across the street. It's a two-family house, so it's very easy to find. And another connection, and this I'm just reading this now, but I was reading the new Lincoln book that's out, and I was talking about coming to the end of the war, and Lincoln actually went to Petersburg, and he was there the day before the battle. And when the battle took place, he was in the vicinity at the, invited by General Grant, and he was anxious for the war to end. They knew it was coming to an end. So he came in, and I just read this, and I got a kick out of it. So he's writing to the Secretary of War, Stanton. And he puts, I was going to say he texted him, but I don't think he did that. So he writes to Stanton and he says, Robert, his son Robert, just now tells me there was a little rumpus up the line this morning, ending about where it began. And that told the story of the battle. And here's Lincoln is quoted, saying that to Stanton, a little rumpus up the road a little bit. And hundreds of people were killed, but it was a little rumpus. And now this part really gets me because supposedly he rode his horse towards the battlefield. Tom said maybe he didn't quite get that far, but it says in the book I'm reading that he witnessed the dead, the burial parties, people being maneuvered around and so on. So who knows? I mean, he may have came right across this body, and looked down upon him. Not really sure. But of course, Walt Whitman, after Lincoln's assassinated a few weeks later, writes, "Oh, Captain, my Captain." So it's kind of funny. He's writing, "Oh, Captain, my Captain" for Abraham Lincoln, and he's writing a Yankee Antique for Frank Harlow. So the weird little mysteries. That's part of our connections. I think that we've kind of proven that East Bridgewater is a special place when it comes to the Civil War. I hope that you feel that way. Because this stuff, it just goes on and on and on, and there's so much more. So we're going to keep on looking, and that's what we're going to do. So thank you very much. Appreciate it. Come on up here with me. We're gonna see if you have questions, or if you just want to have some cookies. You guys can tell me. You can address a question to all of us, any of us, anything that you're thinking of that you want to know about here.
I neglected to tell you, in going through my notes, that in the election that brought Abraham Lincoln to the presidency in 1860, there were 4 political parties, Frank. There was the Republican Party, which was Lincoln. There was a party headed by Douglas. There was a party headed by John Bell. No, John Bell.
Yeah.
John Bell. And John Bell ran on the Constitutional Unionist ticket, which was, forget about slavery, we're just going to have the country live the way it's living. Well, the vice presidential candidate was Edward Everett. He was the vice presidential candidate with Bell. And they carried 3 states, including Virginia, Tennessee. I don't remember the other one. But so it was, he was a significant person.
Can I say a quick word too? Robert Todd Lincoln, you might wonder, how was he down there in that area? Well, obviously Civil War on, and as Dale said, killed 750,000 people, and there's a lot of pressure on the Lincolns. Why is your son not going? And Mary Todd was scared to death that something might happen, but finally there was enough pressure. So Lincoln did write to General Grant and said, by the way, I think it's maybe time for Robert to go into the Army. I'll pay for it all. I'll pay for his uniform, his weapon, and whatever else he needs here, if you could see your way clear to finding a spot for him. Yeah, and what's the commanding general going to say? Yes, I can. So he went on to Grant's staff, and his main function was to keep out of the way and don't become a casualty. But when visitors came, he would often then escort them around the Army of the Potomac, so he did have a function there. So he did end up in there, but before that time, there was, why isn't your son stepping up and going here? He's of an age.
All these faces. I know there's a question out there somewhere. Don't be shy.
Another-
Yes, sir.
Yeah, this is, I'm not sure if it's true or not. I think it was supposed to be at Fort Stedman, where Lincoln was visiting the battle. Wasn't he there? And whatever he was doing, there was somebody, one of the soldiers yelled, "Get your head, put your head down, you damn fool," or something
Damn
like
fool.
that.
It wasn't Stedman.
Fort Fisher.
It was Fort Fisher, yeah.
That's
What
Fort
fi-
Fisher.
okay, well,
Yeah, outside Washington, and there's an interesting story there, as you say, yeah, you have a young captain Holmes, who became a justice
Yeah,
to the
that's
Supreme
right.
Court, and he didn't recognize Lincoln at all. You say, how could that happen? But
He was the
he's
son
the one who
of-
said, "Get down, you damn fool."
Yeah.
Yeah. No, exposed himself to many stories during the war of these known officials, including Robert E. Lee, just going too far forward. And Lincoln did that at Fort Fisher. They said he was right there with his top hat, and he's tall enough anyways, and he got the top hat, exposed to enemy fire, and, yeah.
Can't leave from behind.
Grabbed him. You damn fool. So he got away with it. Yes, sir.
Was there an East Bridgewater soldier killed at Malvern Hill in 1862, part of the 29th?
I would say yes.
Maybe thinking of William Osborne, who wasn't killed, but he was wounded.
William
William
Osborne.
Osborne?
I don't know the
Yeah,
name.
he won the Medal of Honor, Osborne. He didn't die. He was shot, however, and wounded, and kept fighting, and then he was captured. But then eventually, he was released and came back. He wrote the history of the 29th with Osborne. And obviously, the East Bridgewater troops were involved there. I wouldn't be surprised at all if there were
Yes.
several people who might have been killed at that battle. It's certainly
And
possible.
I actually, when you come up here, I have a list of where all of them were killed. So we can find that out tonight pretty easily. But Osborne was an interesting one. The Medal of Honor was brand new during the Civil War, and a lot of people got the honor quite a while after the war, and there was some question, and not to besmirch the guy, he was a young boy, same as Frank Harlow. I understood he got hit in the side by a cannonball, but he was sent back, but then he said, I'm not hurt bad enough, and he grabbed a musket and went and fought with another unit because he couldn't find the 29th. And then he became a judge here in East Bridgewater. He lived in that house that's right down on Hobart Street that they used to call the cottage. Looked like a Swiss cottage there at the end of the street. And he became a judge, and somehow or other, he wound up with the Medal of Honor somewhere around 1890 or so. So he might have had some connections since then.
And the interesting thing with Medal of Honor is you don't get credit for those people if they were not born in your town. Osborne was born in Mattapoisett. If you look him up, it'll say Mattapoisett. Gordon Craig, our other winner, was born in Brockton. There's a reserve center over there named for him. I had a fairly long career in the Army, and the reserves used to be, I was at that center when they dedicated it the day they did that. But neither one of them is listed as East Bridgewater, but they're both buried here in East Bridgewater.
Yeah. If you go to the Elmwood Cemetery, the two of them are buried probably from here to the wall, apart from each other. It's kind of unique that they came from two different towns and they both went to war. They both got the Medal of Honor, and now they're laying side by side from two different wars, 100 years apart.
And if you think of the population size over the years, how many other towns of this size have two men who were given the Medal of Honor?
Yeah, that's right. Be pretty rare.
The other thing I was thinking about, Dale mentioned the Battle of Antietam. Well, the Battle of Antietam is the bloodiest single day in the history of the United States military. More people died and were wounded and casualties in that one single day. And the 29th, as Dale mentioned, was fighting with the Irish Brigade, the 69th New York, which was infamous for its rowdiness. I think the 87th New York and two others, and they attacked in one of the major attacks of that battle that lasted all day long at a place called the Sunken Road. And it was a road that, in those days there were toll roads, and you had to pay a toll to travel on a road that somebody privately probably owned or whatever and charged you. If it was a muddy road in the winter, they made it a corduroy road, which was just logs put in. Well, the Sunken Road had been used for so many years in this farming area that it actually had the road had gotten lower and lower from horses, hoofs, and wagons and so forth. The Confederates took up a position there along this whole road, and the Union attacked it. And one of the attacks was by the Irish Brigade, which the 29th Massachusetts was involved in it. The 29th got the fewest casualties in that brigade because of an act of nature. The road, if you've ever been to Antietam and you ask about it and you walk out to that area, the Sunken Road is literally a major depression, but above it are these fields, and the fields go like this. They roll up and down, and the 29th was put, for whatever reason, just the way they lined up the regiments, in the lowest part of that field. So when the whole regiment, the whole brigade, attacked, supposedly 4,000 men, or supposed to be 4,000 men, the Confederates were shooting at the highest targets they saw, which were the regiments on either side of the 29th. Although the 29th did suffer casualties.
Not nearly as many.
but not nearly as many. Dale mentioned Mary Ann Rowan. Well, Mary Ann Rowan and I were there, and she had the history of the 29th, and we went with the historian through there, and she plotted it, the whole thing out, where the 29th was, so it's interesting.
One of the reasons that we still do this business. Got a question? Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
Just a point of interest, at the present time, the Bridgewater Public Library has an exhibit on the lower level
Okay.
of artifacts from the Civil War which are related to the men from these towns that fought in the Civil War. So it's
Great.
worth a visit right now.
How long is that
Yeah,
open?
Right now, it's through the end of April.
Oh, great. We'll make a point. Field trip. Field trip. Well, one of the reasons, people say, well, how can what's the point of having a round table here? Round tables are very popular down south and out west, where battles had taken place. But, the truth of the matter is, the battles took place because New England, Michigan, Wisconsin, sent people. And the history came back home. That's why in every green in the state, every green across the country has the monument, has the names, because people had to come from somewhere. And if you learn about your local boys, that can expand to other things, and it's always kind of a good study. So, if that's that, I'd ask a few of my roundtable folks to come up and I've got a question.
Do you know of any other soldiers from East Bridgewater or, the Bridgewaters in general that might have served in a different regiment?
Yes.
You
Oh, yeah, there's a listing, there's a book at the library, it's blue. If you go to the desk and ask them for the old history of East Bridgewater, and they list the 360 guys, and they tell what regiment they were in, they tell when they were joined and when they were discharged, or if they were wounded or killed, vice versa. The 38th Massachusetts had about 40 men from East Bridgewater. This company, the 29th, had close to 100. And if you go to the library, I was almost gonna pick it up today and bring it here, but there's a recruiting poster late in the war. And it's beautiful. It says right on it, we need like 12 more men.
I was at Gettysburg and I saw a poster, I took a picture of it. It was Brockton advertising for men go to the Bixby building on Main Street.
Yeah.
And it told you to get like $250 for this, $700
Yeah.
something for that. It sounded like a ton of money. But,
It was a ton of money.
It was at
and
that
it
time.
was, if you survived.
Yeah,
And also, you could have someone else serve for you.
yeah.
You could pay somebody to take your spot.
Substitute
So,
soldiers.
yeah, that's where the Washburn, people with money,
Yeah.
would buy
Well,
something
this,
off.
this business here at the library is beautiful because it's our own town. But
Yeah.
Beth in the back row, she was in New York, right? And she's looking in a window of an antique store, and there's a poster for East Bridgewater soldiers during the Civil War.
Yeah.
How much they
Found
want
that
for it?
fascinating.
You don't remember the price.
Like 700 or something.
Yeah.
Genuine thing, but we got one right at the library, still got the tack holes in it where they posted it against the side of the building. So it's right at the circ desk, take a look and pick up that book, East Bridgewater.
Yeah. I do have some of that
Red
information,
War.
but I didn't know if you had any names, any particular ones, from East Bridgewater directly. other than those men.
I remember, the one name that sticks out to me is the Kingman family.
Yeah,
The
Yeah,
Kingmans
from
were in that
in the
rank.
38th.
Yeah, and there were Kingmans when I was in high school.
I was gonna say, there's still families here that had, the first event that we did here that I was talking about, when it was raining so bad, we were in the room with Margaret Alexander, and my grandson was in the room, and my grandson's great-great-great-great-grandfather fought in the Civil War, and Margaret's grandfather fought in the Civil War, and the two of them were sitting right here. And I said, that's the connection. It wasn't that long ago. My dad, who's 96 now, he remembers seeing veterans in Stoughton marching in the parades. He remembers it clear, like we remembered the World War I veterans when I was a kid. When I was born, World War II had only ended 6 years before. So we lived our whole life with World War II veterans. But we had a straggling of World War I veterans. It's just the time.
Yeah, I mentioned the shoe factories and Mitchell's and
Oh, yeah.
Kingman's, Keith's.
Yeah,
So
Keith's, yeah.
again, very still common names. I'm sure probably people still living, the descendants there in the
Absolutely.
town. Yeah.
All right, well, we're gonna break to eat some food and talk and enjoy yourselves. Stick around for a few minutes. We got some